It's kind of a real shame because, you know, at this point, some of you might be saying, hello everyone, welcome to the video. Today you find me back in Colorado. That's right, I have made it back to the good old Colorado. In fact, no haze, perfect sun, great day. And what you don't find me is at an MG convention. You actually find me at Arapahoe Community College for their annual Concours d'Elegance. So when I'm talking, because you don't want to hear me ramble about nothing, frankly, let's go check out some cars and talk about those. Now you might not know this about me, but I love Volvo P1800s. I mean, to be fair, I love most sports cars, and this is the Swedish sports car. It might be the, I say definitive one. There's probably some other brands I'm forgetting right now that are Swedish that also make sports cars and or supercars, but for me, this is the definitive Swedish sports car, and what makes this slightly more interesting than a normal P1800, though P1800s are lovely in their own right, is the fact that it's a shooting brake, or basically a two-door wagon, I think, for those of us in the, for the rest of us in the States. And not all shooting brakes work, okay? Making something a shooting brake doesn't immediately make something good. With that said, this is a fantastic shooting brake. It works so well. And honestly, I think I actually kind of prefer it to the normal P1800 coupe roofline, because the roofline of a normal P1800 ends right around here, and then you have a lot of trunk. And so I like that it's filled all the way out to the back with a lot of glass. It makes it a little bit like a fastback, even though it doesn't have that kind of roofline. Now, when on a modern car have you ever seen so much glass? I mean, look at this. You can peek right into the rear. The visibility is amazing. There'd be no problem just backing out like that. Not an issue. Now, to be fair, with modern cars, we know why the greenhouses are much smaller than they used to be. Safety, pillars, way bigger. But wouldn't it be safer to have more glass so you could, you know, see where you're going, what you're doing? I mean, I'm all for the thicker pillars so that I don't get crushed in a rollover crash, but I'm not a fan of the sacrifice of having much more glass. Now, how often do you see a Mitsubishi 3000 GTO? And not only that, how many do you see that are this nice? I don't mean to offend anyone, but 3000 GTs and definitely Dodge Stealths. Don't even get me started on those. Very often are in fair to good condition, maybe good if we're going by Craigslist standards. But this one is genuinely nice. I mean, the paint job is exquisite. It's not metallic, but it is a very bright, loud red. And almost like a very Ferrari red, if I'm being honest with you. But I mean, that's way better than the grays and the silvers and the black of cars that we very normally see in the modern era. Now, at this point, some of you might be saying, okay, it looks pretty good, but it's just a Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi is nothing to celebrate now. Mitsubishi is nothing interesting now, and you'd be right. But the difference with the 3000 GT is that it's not just a coupe Mitsubishi that looks pretty darn good, might I add. The Mitsubishi 3000 GT was a rather special car because it was really technologically advanced for the time. It had active aero. Now this one doesn't, but you had an active rear wing. Now, as far as I know, it only went up a little bit, tilt a little bit. You had a very 911 turbo style rubber air dam that would deploy at the front above speeds of, I think it was 60 miles per hour. Certainly at high speeds, it would deploy to keep this car hunkered to the ground, to keep it stable. And it had four-wheel steering, like the 1989 Honda Prelude, actually. So, it might be a Mitsubishi. It might come from a company that is a lot like Lancia now, actually. But in its heyday, just like Lancia, they pumped out very, very interesting coupes indeed. I mean, four-wheel steering, Porsche only does that now. Well, I say they only do that now. More companies do that now. Ferrari do that with the 812, the Competizione. They did it with the F12. They did it with the 812. But for a relatively normal, semi-mid-market coupe like this, we just don't see four-wheel steering on what would effectively be roughly Mustang territory now. I mean, these were 40,000, 50,000 back in the 90s, and that's nearly, I'd imagine, nearly 80,000 now. So again, not cheap. But four-wheel steering on a car of that price is still way cheaper than other cars even now that have four-wheel steering. If you ask me, that's relatively revolutionary, even though no one followed the revolution. And here we have an exceptionally rare American sports car, the Panoz Esperante. In my mind, these are kind of like road-going American Genettas, you know, a smaller company that makes FMR sports cars meant to compete with the likes, in American terms at the very least, with the likes of the Viper and the Corvette. Something I find personally interesting about this very Esperante isn't the fact that it has a forward engine. Most Panoz Esperantes do. What I find interesting is that it has a great whopping supercharger on it. Like these already made around 302 to nearly 400 horsepower, and with the supercharger, this one probably makes nearly 400 horsepower, if not 400 horsepower. I mean, supercharged sports car. If it were all-wheel drive, I'd darn nearly call it an early 2000s American Jaguar F-Type SVR. But it's not, because it's rear-wheel drive. And arguably a bit racier than an F-Type, because an F-Type's a bit more of a GT car, though not quite as GT as the earlier XKR. Actually, considering the Esperante was made in the early 2000s, and it has a supercharged Ford V8, and I saw it's a 4.6 liter Ford V8, I bet you anything, this is the same V8 that you can find in Terminator New Edge Mustangs, which means if you were to modify it, you could get some hella kick. I think what I find particularly interesting about looking at this Panoz Esperante in the flesh is how much it reminds me of the 90s Shelby Series 1. Remember how Carroll Shelby won his own modern day, technically with the looks it'd be more like a Daytona Coupe Roadster, but he wanted his own like Viper equivalent. So he set out to make his own, well, Shelby Daytona Coupe Roadster, but his own modern Cobra. And that was the Series 1 concept. And from roughly this angle, not really the front, but from this angle, it actually looks kind of like that. Okay, we're good. And here we have my favorite modern BMW, the BMW 1M. And the reason why it's my favorite is because I feel like it harkens back to the E30s that are actually here, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They were smaller, they were tighter, they were lighter. The engine in this car actually does it. In fact, the whole car uses bits and bobs from M3s of multiple eras. I think the differentials from the E92 M3, the engine is from the E46 M3, so it's kind of a mishmash of parts, but it works. It works brilliantly, and what I love about this one in particular is that it's in the exact same spec that Jeremy Clarkson drove on Top Gear all those years ago. It's got the right orange and the right BMW wheels, and they're in the right color. I love this because, as I was saying, it goes back to when BMWs were lighter, smaller. They were just tighter because we have a new M4, the one that has the like massive big nostril noses, and I like it way better in the flesh visually than it looks in photos. But if I were to have a BMW, it would be this or an M2. In fact, the M2 is second only to this. Sorry if I look blown out, but on the camera there was a lot of shadow here, so I had to bump it up. So I mean, you will be able to see me. I just might look a little bit brighter than I do normally. But I find it so fascinating that BMW decided to use the engine from the E46 M3, and if I remember correctly, that's a straight six. It's a twin turbo straight six. Although I think in this application it might only be a single turbo, but it still produces over 300 horsepower. And to put that into perspective, this doesn't weigh that much more than a Viper. I think it's 3,300, 3,500 pounds, which is arguably maybe a little heavy for a car of this size, roughly Miata sized, but keep in mind, it's got way more interior than a Miata. It's got a much bigger interior, a more luxurious interior. It's a full-on car. And to its credit, this is still a sort of sedan, right? The Miata is a proper sports car, which means it doesn't have any of the compromises that a coupe sedan-like vehicle that this has. It's the difference between a Camaro and a Corvette. A Camaro is what I call a sport coupe, arguably a pony car. I mean, I call a BMW M4 a sport coupe, and the reason why is because those, not necessarily in the Camaro's case, but definitely in the M4's case, is a BMW M3 with two doors taken off, but still has roughly the same sedan roofline. Whereas BMW Z3, for example, BMW Z4 is a proper sports car. That means much smaller interior, much more compromises in its construction to make it better handling. And this is along those lines of an M4. It's not a Z4, it's not a Z3, but even still, given its size, 300 plus horsepower, turbo, 3,400, 3,500 pounds, this thing can scoot. Now, of all the things that fascinate me about the 1M, I think the most minor, perhaps reaching detail that intrigues me about this car is the wheel design here. And the reason why is because if you look at this, and if you look at Hellcat, what is it? Hellcat, what do they call them? I don't remember what the wheel name is, but the wheels that are on Gen 5 Viper ACRs and some Hellcats, it looks very, very, very similar to this. Like it almost looks like someone took those wheels, took off the Dodge end cap, and then put a BMW one on instead. I love this wheel design, but I'm surprised how similar it really looks. No, your eyes do not deceive you. This is indeed a Lancia Fulvia. Yes, normally these are only in Europe, but because these hail from an era from the 60s, right around the same as the Austin Mini, it fits the 25-year import rule. One of the most interesting things about, oh wait, I'm not in shot. Ha! One of the most interesting things about this car is the fact that it's front-wheel drive. Except that's not the most interesting bit, because the Austin Mini was front-wheel drive. No, what makes this car interesting is that it has a V4. Yes, a V4, like a V6, with 2 cylinders chopped off. As far as I know, it is the only car to ever have a V4, certainly the only production car to ever have a V4, and not only does it have a V4 and front-wheel drive, it actually has some motorsport pedigree. Those who know Lancia's history know that Lancia, like Audi and Subaru, are big rally. It's a big rally brand. Okay, they've won a ton of races back in the 60s. Motorsport pedigree, just like the Austin Mini. Front-wheel drive, just like the Austin Mini. 4 cylinders, albeit in a different arrangement, just like the Austin Mini, except in a completely different body that arguably looks a little better, but still, same motorsport pedigree. Basically, to an extent, this is sort of like an Italian Austin Mini. It's kind of a real shame, because cars like the Fulvia, cars like the Stratos, and more Lancias, Delta HF Integrale, the S4, remind us of how great Lancia once was. Though, to be fair, Carlos Tavares, the CEO of Stellantis, has given all FCA North America brands and even Lancia 10 years to get their crap together, essentially. So maybe there is hope for Lancia yet, because I would love to see a new Fulvia, and not that concept from the 2000s. Something at least a little more faithful to the original. So like I said at the beginning, V4 engine, at least that's what these originally had. Now, not a lot of horsepower, just a little bit south, just a little bit north of 100, but because these were really, really light, like Austin Minis, they were very, very fast, and that's how they got so many wins on the rally stage. Now, something that's particularly interesting about this Fulvia that I didn't know until I heard some people talking about it just a minute ago is that this one's actually a resto mod. Someone has resto modded a Lancia Fulvia. How awesome is that? Like, because we all know about resto modded Camaros, resto modded Challengers, resto modded Mustangs. Muscle cars are very typically resto modded. Hell, even E-types are resto modded pretty frequently, but Lancias and a Fulvia? I love the uniqueness, and it's resto modded with a 2.5 liter Subaru Boxer 4. So you went from a V4 to a Boxer 4, so you kind of kept it within the same idea, a small 4-cylinder, and still used a more, we'll say, out there engine configuration in the form of a Boxer, though not as out there as a V4, of course. But who does that? Who resto mods a Lancia? Like, how awesome is that? I'm not sure I want to know what the engine bay looks like, mostly because I'm not sure if it's going to be really like neat and tidy or if it's going to be kind of stuff everywhere, but it would be really interesting not only to hear this thing, but to see the engine bay, whether it's clean or cluttered. And there is the modified engine bay. Not nearly the mess I thought it would be. I mean, there are wires everywhere. There's a lot of lines going to places, but to be honest, that's no worse than a lot of modern cars, to be honest with you, especially those that have twin turbos. That's pretty clean. That is a surprisingly, I mean, I'm not gonna say it looks like it was an easy swap, but what I am gonna say is that works a lot better than I thought it would. One thing you'll notice about the engine and its relationship to the wheels is that the engine actually sits in front of the front axle. Now, normally, that's a disaster. I mean, we know Audis, early Audis, like from the 2010 to like 2014 era, understeer like crazy because the engine is in front of the front axle. But the reason why it works here is because this is front wheel drive. Having weight over the front tires increases their traction, which is very helpful when you're driving on a rally stage where tarmac is sparse. It is not at all what you think it is. It is not at all what you think it is. It's not a Triumph TR6. It's not a Triumph. You might not even know what, you probably don't know what it is. I didn't either until I talked to the owner just a minute ago. In fact, when I think 10 minutes after I got here. So what this is a Python Mustang. It was designed by McKinley Thompson Jr. The body was, and it is entirely fiberglass. And if you're thinking you're impressed by my knowledge, don't be, because I'm just repeating what the owner told me. But even still, the information here, even though my own knowledge of the car is relatively minimal, any little tidbit about this thing is incredibly interesting because it doesn't look like a Mustang. And for those who want to know what era of Mustang this is based on, what era of Mustang the body has been grafted onto, it's been grafted onto a Fox body Mustang. And now that I've said that, you might actually be able to see it because it looks relatively small. I mean, Fox body Mustangs aren't that big. They're not massive. They're not like the 05. They're not like, hell, they're not even like the S550s now. They're a lot smaller. So as far as dimensions go, this looks about Fox body size. It looks right. And another thing that gives away that it's a Fox body is the fact that it has a 5.0 V8. That's another thing that tipped me off to the fact that it might be a Fox body, because if it was in early 2005, in early S197, it would probably have a 4.6 liter V8 or the Terminator 4.6 V8 from the New Edge Mustangs. But no, this has a 5.0, much like later Fox bodies in the 80s. But I mean, what a way to spruce up a Fox body, right? Like, we see Fox bodies all the time. I even saw a Fox body last year drifting at Drift Colorado up in Erie. And this just, I love that car, but this puts it to shame. It really does, because this is how you make a Mustang completely and utterly unique. If you look at the front here, all the way to about the A-pillar, it kind of makes me think of the late 70s Triumph TR6, mostly because it has those squared off body lines very similar to that. But obviously this looks way better because it doesn't have that weird window on the B-pillar right around here because it's a drop top. If you could get a big squared off like 80s Miata, I think this would be relatively close to that. Something else really, because the whole car throws you for a loop. Something else that threw me for a loop when it comes to this car is the front end. Because I see these headlights, I see this front end, and my mind immediately goes, Knight Rider, is that you? Pontiac Firebird, Knight Rider, is that you? But it isn't. It isn't at all. The proportions are wrong. I don't think it's quite wide enough to be a Pontiac Firebird. I mean, let alone anything other than a rebodied Fox body. But yeah, it might look a little bit like a Firebird. It might look a little like Knight Rider, but it really isn't. It looks a lot more like a TR6, this close to it. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Proof that I was not lying. 5 liter V8, 5 liter high output too. Although, you know, for the 80s, that means like 225 horsepower, which is still a lot with a fiberglass body and a steel chassis, a car that weighs less than 3,000 pounds. That's nothing to sneeze at for the 80s, especially for the American auto market, because oil crisis, insurance, basically every single thing working, everything possible working to conspire against the American car enthusiast, but even the muscle car as well. But again, proof that I'm not lying, that it is actually based on a Fox body Mustang. I mean, sure, it would be, you know, it's easy enough to say, oh look, here's a Fox body era engine, but look at the wheelbase, look at the length. The engine should be proof. 5.0, 1980s, Ford Mustang, high output V8. Now, some of you may not have seen a Fox body interior, and If I'm honest with you, I can't remember the last time I saw one either, but all of that looks pretty OEM. Now, if you look over there, where there's a little badge on the corner, where the Ford badge should be, you might see Python. As far as I can tell, that's just a little sticker. The rest of it, I bet you, is OEM Fox Body Mustang. At this very moment, I'll probably pop up a photo of the correct year or nearly correct year of Fox Body Mustang. Apparently, this car is 1991, was a 1991, or it is a 1991 Python Mustang. Does that make it a 1991 Mustang base? Okay, so this is the base car is a 1991 Mustang. So I'll have to go find the interior shot of a 1991 Mustang and then compare it to this. But 1991 Mustang, Python Mustang with a little Python badge over there, but the rest of it, for the most part, for the money, I would have to say, looks pretty standard. And there is one more thing I need to show you. So I'm sure at this point you're saying, Cody, why? Superbike. So I'm sure at this point you're probably saying, Cody, why are you showing me the door? Like, why this angle? Like, you're not even showing the full door. The reason why I'm showing you the door is this portion right here, because the owner was telling me that everything inside here, excluding the outside body, is OEM Fox Body Mustang. And I wanted to point out, because this isn't OEM Fox Body Mustang, it's a part of the outer panel of the door, but it looks OEM. It doesn't look like a kit car. There's no massive gaps. It looks OEM. It looks like a special option. Like, if Zagato, perhaps, had made a coach-built Mustang, shall we say, this would be the level of craftsmanship I would expect. But this was just made by a designer here in the States, McKinley Thompson Jr. And the craftsmanship on this little door panel here, on the inner door panel, is amazing. You really wouldn't be able to tell that it wasn't OEM outside of the obvious fact that it isn't OEM, because no Mustang ever looks like this. There were other cars around the place as well. There was a 90s Ford Escort Cosworth, a classic flat-nosed Porsche 911 sporting a gorgeous stripe package, a collection of Saabs, your usual collection of Corvettes, this jaw-dropping Impala, and a good deal more. While the overall turnout was a bit of a letdown when compared to ACC Concours of yore, I can't say I didn't enjoy myself, nor the cars I saw. Hopefully the next ACC Concours gets more entries and I get more time to talk about more cars. Alrighty everyone, so here is a slightly different video, or I guess shooting style I suppose, very vlog-like. I wasn't going to do a vlog style, but they're ending soon. Actually, they're ending very soon. And so this is, yep, as you can imagine, this is the outro for the video. So I still got to get photos, actually. I got to get a lot of photos. And so that's partially why I'm ending rather soon. And if you're wondering why I'm walking backwards, because I am walking backwards, it's because the band is right there. And I really don't want to be shooting into the music. So yeah. But yeah, so this is the end of the video. At the very least, this is the outro. I got a few other video bits to record technically, so I'll do that. I got a lot of photos to get. Hopefully I'll be able to do it all before the event ends. But in any case, I hope you all enjoyed this walkthrough of some of the cars that are here at the Arapahoe Community College Concours d'Elegance. If you enjoyed, please make sure to like, comment, share, and consider subscribing. And if you do subscribe, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate that. Please make sure you hit the little notification bell and then all notifications, that way you are notified every time I upload. I will see you all next time.